The Pahalgam attack, the spark of a new crisis. On April 22, 2025, the peaceful region of Pahalgam in Jammu and Kashmir was shattered by a brutal terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 27 people. Among the victims were 25 Hindu tourists, one Christian traveler, and a local Muslim guide. The militant group known as the Resistance Front, TRF, claimed responsibility, reigniting long-standing tensions between India and Pakistan. The Indian government immediately accused Pakistan of harboring and supporting terrorist groups operating in Kashmir, an allegation Pakistan denied. This horrific event served as the catalyst for a new and dangerous escalation between two nuclear-armed neighbors. India's response, Operation Sindoor. In response to the attack, on May 7, India launched Operation Sindoor, a series of targeted airstrikes on what it identified as terrorist infrastructure in both Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Utilizing advanced Rafale fighter jets equipped with Scalp missiles and AASM hammer bombs, the Indian Air Force struck 9 locations, including Bahawalpur, Murid, and Muzaffarabad. Indian authorities described the strikes as precise, measured, and non-escalatory, aimed solely at dismantling terrorist networks. However, the Pakistani government viewed the operation as a direct act of aggression and vowed to retaliate. Pakistan's retaliation and military escalation. Pakistan responded swiftly, launching air and artillery strikes on Indian military positions along the line of control. It claimed to have downed 5 Indian aircraft and fired ballistic missiles at Indian military facilities. Both nations reported casualties. India confirmed 21 civilian and 5 military deaths, while Pakistan reported the deaths of 40 civilians and 11 soldiers. The rapid escalation and severity of military exchanges alarmed the global community, raising fears of a full-scale war between two nuclear powers. International diplomacy steps in. With tensions at a boiling point, the international community sprang into action to prevent further conflict. The United States, under President Donald Trump, played a central role in mediating talks, alongside 36 other nations, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. On May 10, after intense behind-the-scenes negotiations, both countries agreed to a ceasefire set to begin at 5 p.m. IST. While Pakistan publicly thanked the international community for its role, India downplayed outside involvement, insisting that its decision was based on national security interests. Diplomatic fallout and unilateral actions. Despite the ceasefire, diplomatic relations between India and Pakistan continued to deteriorate. India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, closed the Atari Wagah border post, and revoked all visas issued to Pakistani nationals. It also expelled Pakistani diplomats and withdrew its own from Islamabad. In response, Pakistan shut its airspace to Indian flights and suspended bilateral trade. These unilateral moves underscored the deep distrust that continues to define the relationship between the two nations. Humanitarian impact and civilian displacement. The human cost of the conflict was devastating. Thousands of civilians on both sides were displaced by artillery fire and aerial bombardments. In areas like Punch, Jammu and Kashmir, critical infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, and homes were damaged or destroyed. International humanitarian organizations expressed serious concern over the growing refugee crisis and called for urgent aid to assist those caught in the crossfire. Media narratives and the role of disinformation. As the conflict unfolded, state-run and private media in both countries engaged in aggressive narrative building. Indian media highlighted the precision and necessity of Operation Sindoor, while Pakistani outlets focused on India's alleged violations of sovereignty and the suffering of civilians. Social media platforms saw a spike in misinformation, with fake news and propaganda fueling public anger and making diplomatic efforts even more difficult. Political reactions within India and Pakistan. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi took a firm stance, describing the ceasefire as merely a pause and warning that India would not hesitate to take further action if threatened. His position was supported by nationalist factions but criticized by opposition leaders and human rights advocates. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif faced domestic pressure to respond forcefully, even as he tried to rally international support to condemn India's airstrikes. Future outlook and peace challenges. While the ceasefire halted immediate hostilities, the prospects for long-term peace remain uncertain. Deep-rooted mistrust, unresolved territorial disputes in Kashmir, and the continued presence of militant groups in the region are major obstacles. The international community has urged both countries to return to the negotiating table and pursue peaceful solutions, but the path to reconciliation is fraught with complexity and historical baggage. The role of the international community in regional stability. This recent crisis has once again highlighted the critical role the international community must play in preventing conflicts between nuclear states. The mediation efforts led by the US and other global powers were instrumental in averting a larger war. However, the sustainability of such efforts depends on India and Pakistan's willingness to engage in honest dialogue and commit to long-term peacebuilding. Regional stability in South Asia will require consistent and collaborative efforts to prevent further violence. Aftermath of the ceasefire, tensions simmer under the surface. Although the ceasefire was officially declared and largely held across the border regions, signs of tension were far from gone. Patrol units on both sides of the line of control remained on high alert. Occasional skirmishes, though unconfirmed by either government, were reported by local residents. Civilians living in border villages expressed both relief and fear. Relief that the immediate shelling had stopped, but feared that the peace was only temporary. Daily life remained disrupted, and the military presence served as a constant reminder of the fragile peace. Kashmir caught in the middle. The people of Jammu and Kashmir found themselves in a painfully familiar position, caught between geopolitical crossfire. In Srinagar and other towns, a heavy military presence restricted movement. Protests broke out in some areas, with youth demanding accountability and a long-term resolution to the Kashmir conflict. Indian authorities imposed intermittent curfews, citing security concerns, while local leaders pleaded for the restoration of normalcy and civil liberties. Meanwhile, humanitarian aid trickled into the region, insufficient to meet the growing needs of displaced and traumatized civilians. Voices of the displaced. In makeshift shelters on both sides of the border, stories of loss and displacement were shared quietly, often with tears and disbelief. A father from the Indian side recounted how he had to carry his injured daughter for 2 kilometers after their village was hit. In Pakistan-administered Kashmir, an elderly woman described watching her home burn down while hiding with her grandchildren in a ditch. Aid workers reported that many displaced families had little access to clean water, medicine, or psychological support. For these civilians, the political motives behind the violence felt painfully irrelevant. Cyber conflict, the war beyond borders. While bombs and bullets had paused, a different kind of conflict continued in cyberspace. State-sponsored hackers from both countries allegedly engaged in digital attacks targeting infrastructure, financial institutions, and government servers. Several Indian news portals and government sites were temporarily taken offline, reportedly by Pakistani hacker groups, while Pakistan's communication ministry claimed that Indian actors had breached internal networks. Although both governments denied involvement in cyber warfare, the growing frequency of digital skirmishes added another layer of danger to the ongoing hostilities. India's strategic diplomacy with the West. In New Delhi, Indian officials intensified efforts to build stronger alliances with Western nations, especially the United States and members of the European Union. India's narrative focused on counter-terrorism and its right to defend its citizens against cross-border militancy. Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar held a series of high-level meetings to present intelligence reports linking militant camps to Pakistani territory. India's strategy was clear: garner global support to isolate Pakistan diplomatically, while ensuring that its military actions were seen as justified and restrained. Pakistan's regional maneuvering. On the other side, Pakistan leaned heavily into regional alliances, particularly with China, Iran, and Turkey, to balance India's growing international influence. Islamabad emphasized the humanitarian crisis in Kashmir and accused India of committing human rights violations. Prime Minister Sharif visited Beijing and Tehran to strengthen economic and military ties, presenting Pakistan as a victim of unjust aggression. In the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, Pakistan found a sympathetic audience, but struggled to shift the broader narrative in the global media. The shadow of nuclear threat. Though neither side explicitly mentioned the use of nuclear weapons, the unspoken threat lingered like a shadow over the entire crisis. International think tanks issued warnings about the region's volatility, and defense analysts closely monitored both countries' nuclear readiness. Satellite imagery revealed increased activity at certain missile bases, prompting quiet diplomatic backchannels aimed at de-escalation. Civil society groups in both India and Pakistan held peace vigils, reminding their governments and the world of the catastrophic consequences should the situation spiral beyond control. Economic fallout and investor anxiety. Beyond the borders, the conflict took a toll on both nations' economies. Stock markets in Mumbai and Karachi experienced volatility, while foreign investors adopted a wait-and-see approach. Tourism in India's northern states suffered a sharp decline, and border trade came to a complete halt. Pakistan, already facing an economic crunch, saw its rupee dip and inflation rise. The cost of war, even without a formal declaration, was already being felt by ordinary citizens trying to survive in an increasingly unstable environment. Youth and the politics of nationalism. One of the more subtle yet powerful effects of the conflict was its impact on the younger generation. Social media became a battleground of its own, flooded with patriotic slogans, propaganda videos, and emotionally charged testimonials. In both countries, nationalist fervor surged among students and youth groups, many of whom rallied behind their governments without fully understanding the nuances of the conflict. While some called for dialogue and peace, others demanded retaliation and revenge, exposing the deep divisions and emotional scars that war rhetoric leaves behind. A pause, not a peace. As days turned into weeks, it became increasingly evident that the ceasefire was more of a pause than a pathway to peace. The structural issues, territorial disputes, cross-border militancy, political rhetoric remained unresolved. Leaders on both sides spoke cautiously in public, projecting calm, while quietly maintaining military readiness. International observers warned that without sustained diplomatic engagement, the region risked falling back into confrontation. For the millions living in the shadow of this rivalry, the question wasn't just whether war would return, but when. Silent front lines and the lull of anxiety. Despite the outward calm that followed the ceasefire, soldiers stationed along the line of control described a palpable tension that never quite dissipated. The silence in the border zones was not peace, it was the kind of stillness that felt temporary, even performative. On both sides, there were constant drills, night patrols, and radar surveillance. Indian and Pakistani commanders avoided direct communication, even as intelligence agencies continued their shadow games behind the scenes. For the soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, the waiting was often more mentally taxing than the fighting. China's quiet calculations. As regional tensions flared, China observed closely but cautiously. A longtime ally of Pakistan and a wary competitor of India, Beijing offered carefully worded statements calling for restraint and dialogue. Yet behind diplomatic niceties, China's military posture in the Himalayas subtly shifted. Satellite images captured increased activity near the line of actual control, with some analysts suggesting that China was using the crisis as an opportunity to pressure India on multiple fronts. Indian defense planners began considering the possibility of a two-front conflict, a worst-case scenario they had long feared. Voices from the valley. In Kashmir's capital, Srinagar, a strange mixture of dread and exhaustion hung in the air. Schools were partially reopened, but many parents refused to send their children. Markets operated with uncertainty, closing at the first rumor of unrest. Local journalists reported rising frustration among youth, who saw their futures disappearing into barbed wire and curfews. NGOs trying to provide mental health support noted a spike in anxiety and depression, particularly among teenagers. "It feels like we live in a story written by others," said one Kashmiri University student, "but we pay the price." Cross-border cultural ties strained. Beyond politics and military conflict, the strain reached deep into cultural and personal connections. Cross-border marriages, once rare but growing, now faced insurmountable barriers. Artists who had collaborated across the divide were suddenly silenced. Indian music was pulled from Pakistani platforms, and Pakistani TV dramas were banned from Indian streaming services. Sports, too, became a casualty. Plans for a long-awaited India-Pakistan cricket series were cancelled indefinitely, fueling further resentment among fans and players alike. Where once there had been cautious people-to-people warmth, there was now a wall of suspicion. Intelligence agencies in overdrive. As official diplomacy froze, unofficial channels of intelligence heated up. RAW, India's Research and Analysis Wing, and ISI, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, intensified surveillance, counter-surveillance, and cyber operations. Informants disappeared, phone lines were tapped, and encrypted channels buzzed with movement reports. In major cities, agents moved in shadows, watching not only each other's nationals but also third-country operatives with stakes in the region. Rumors of covert missions, sabotage plots, and espionage attempts floated through intelligence circles. Neither government confirmed these stories, but both subtly acted as if they were true. The burden on border communities. In rural areas near the conflict zones, villagers returned to charred homes, broken schools, and damaged infrastructure. Humanitarian aid was slow and patchy, particularly in politically sensitive areas. With crops destroyed and livestock lost, many faced the threat of long-term economic ruin. The Indian government promised reconstruction funds, while Pakistani officials launched relief campaigns, but delays in bureaucracy created frustration. Meanwhile, landmines laid decades ago and forgotten in peacetime now posed new dangers, especially to children playing in fields they didn't know had become deadly. A shift in civilian discourse. As days passed, a surprising shift began to emerge within civil society. Amid the nationalist noise, quieter voices called for accountability, truth, and reform. Journalists, academics, and former diplomats from both countries began publishing essays questioning the costs of perpetual hostility. Online forums saw rising engagement from younger citizens who demanded a new approach, one rooted in economic cooperation and cultural dialogue. These were not mainstream narratives yet, but they hinted at a slow undercurrent of change. In the halls of government, however, those voices were still largely ignored. Regional allies walk a tightrope. India and Pakistan's immediate neighbors, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, found themselves in a delicate position. Publicly, they advocated for peace, yet each had its own geopolitical and economic considerations. Bangladesh, wary of regional instability, reinforced border security and delayed several trade initiatives. Afghanistan, grappling with its own internal crisis, feared the conflict could spill into its territory. Nepal offered to mediate quietly, while Sri Lanka remained focused on its debt negotiations with global creditors. The conflict, though centered in Kashmir, reverberated throughout South Asia. The global media divide. International coverage of the crisis revealed clear biases. Western outlets largely echoed India's narrative of counter-terrorism, while media in the Islamic world focused on Kashmir's humanitarian plight. In the global south, coverage was more mixed, often shaped by historical alliances or trade relationships. Social media influencers and independent journalists attempted to bridge the information gap, but their reach was limited compared to state-controlled networks. This divide in global storytelling shaped how the world responded, both in policy and in public opinion. No end in sight, yet talks loom. Behind closed doors, some form of diplomacy was slowly being prepared. Mid-level envoys and back-channel negotiators met discreetly in neutral locations such as Geneva, Doha, and Muscat. There was no formal dialogue, yet only exploratory conversations about conditions, red lines, and timelines. India demanded firm commitments on anti-terrorism. Pakistan insisted on lifting sanctions and resuming diplomatic contact. Both remained skeptical of each other's intentions. But for the first time since the Pahalgam attack, there was a whisper, barely audible, of potential talks. It was not hope, not yet. But it was movement. Back-channel diplomacy in motion. Even as the official rhetoric remained rigid, private emissaries and retired diplomats, long part of the region's informal peace architecture, began engaging in confidence-building efforts. In private villas on the outskirts of Geneva, a trusted Indian former intelligence chief met with a Pakistani counterpart who had once headed their own spy agency. Their meetings were unofficial, undocumented, and deniable, but critical. They weren't negotiating treaties, they were feeling for cracks in the walls of mistrust. These men, now outside of government but deeply connected, understood that their informal talks might one day unlock formal ones. Media blackouts and narrative control. Back home, both governments tightened their grip on the flow of information. In India, certain independent news outlets were warned against undermining national unity through overly critical coverage. In Pakistan, journalists covering the situation in Kashmir were reportedly detained or silenced. State broadcasters aired highly controlled narratives, stories of valor, unity, and national resolve. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of misinformation, patriotism, and panic. For the average citizen, the truth of what was happening at the border, or even within their own country, became increasingly difficult to decipher. Religious rhetoric on the rise. Religious leaders across both nations began to play a more visible role in shaping public sentiment. In India, some right-wing figures framed the conflict in civilizational terms, calling for unity against a common enemy. In Pakistan, prominent clerics held public prayers and sermons invoking divine justice for the suffering of Kashmiris. While many religious leaders urged peace and restraint, others inflamed tensions by invoking historical grievances and identity politics. The dangerous intertwining of nationalism and religious zeal added another layer of volatility to an already combustible atmosphere. Disinformation and the war of perception. Meanwhile, a war of perception unfolded online. Doctored videos of airstrikes, manipulated images of supposed atrocities, and deepfake clips of military leaders spread like wildfire. Troll farms operated from anonymous locations, churning out memes, hashtags, and outrage. Governments denied involvement, but cybersecurity experts traced much of the traffic to accounts linked with official networks. For millions of people scrolling through their phones, fiction and fact merged, reinforcing already hardened views. It wasn't just a battle for territory anymore, it was a battle for the narrative. Economic fatigue and public discontent. Weeks into the standoff, the economic strain began to surface more visibly. In India, fuel prices rose steadily, and stock indexes fluctuated with every whisper of escalation. In Pakistan, foreign currency reserves dropped to alarming levels, prompting new appeals for loans from allies. Small businesses across both countries felt the pinch, from disrupted supply chains to consumer anxiety. While national leaders maintained their defiant postures, ordinary citizens began asking harder questions. How long could this go on? And who, exactly, was benefiting from this prolonged tension? Families torn across the border. For families with loved ones on both sides of the divide, the conflict brought deep personal anguish. Thousands of people, especially in Punjab and Kashmir, shared bloodlines that had survived partition, war, and distance. Now, once routine phone calls went unanswered, letters were undelivered, and visa applications remained frozen. Elderly parents missed weddings and funerals. Childhood friends lost contact. As the conflict hardened national borders, it shattered the emotional bridges many had spent a lifetime trying to preserve. The pain was silent but immense, deep, private collateral of a public crisis. Kashmiri politicians speak out. As conditions worsened in the valley, several prominent Kashmiri leaders, including those under house arrest or political surveillance, began to issue cautious public statements. Former chief ministers, community leaders, and religious heads spoke of a need for dialogue, not only between India and Pakistan, but with the people of Kashmir themselves. They warned that continued marginalization would breed further alienation, and that any future solution without Kashmiri representation would be unsustainable. Their statements, though not widely broadcast in national media, resonated deeply within the region. Cross-border shelling resumes briefly. In early morning hours on the 45th day of the ceasefire, reports emerged of renewed shelling in the Kupwara sector. Mortars were fired, prompting a brief exchange of retaliatory fire. Both sides accused the other of initiating the incident. While the skirmish lasted less than 2 hours and was quickly contained, it reignited public fear that the ceasefire could collapse at any moment. Local villagers fled their homes once again, returning to hastily prepared shelters. Though leaders called for calm, the ground reality betrayed how precarious the peace really was. International mediation considered. With tensions simmering, international actors quietly floated proposals for formal mediation. The United Nations, through its Special Envoy for South Asia, offered to host neutral talks in Geneva or Vienna. Norway and Switzerland volunteered to facilitate dialogues, leveraging their history as peace brokers. The United States and Saudi Arabia reportedly coordinated a quiet diplomatic initiative involving senior officials from both nations. Yet India remained skeptical of third-party involvement, reiterating its long-held position that Kashmir is a bilateral issue. Pakistan, eager for external arbitration, lobbied hard but found the door only partially open. The shadow of the next spark. In Islamabad and New Delhi, think tanks and intelligence units began modeling what the next flashpoint could be. Would it be another terror attack? A misinterpreted military movement? A drone strike gone wrong? As these scenarios were wargamed behind closed doors, citizens were left with a single, gnawing anxiety that one small spark could again ignite the flame. The region was stuck in a purgatory, neither war nor peace, but something in between. A place where history repeated itself in the absence of bold change. The turning point, behind closed doors. The breakthrough came not from podiums or primetime broadcasts, but through a quiet meeting in Muscat. After weeks of back-channel diplomacy, mid-level envoys from India and Pakistan sat across from each other with international observers present, not to argue, but to listen. For hours, they discussed non-negotiable points and potential concessions. They didn't find total agreement, but they found enough space to move forward. A joint statement was drafted, reviewed, and cautiously approved by leadership in both capitals. It wasn't a peace deal, but it was a beginning. Joint statement and a pledge to de-escalate. 3 days later, both governments released coordinated public statements announcing a renewed commitment to a lasting ceasefire, resumption of diplomatic dialogue, and structured confidence-building measures. There was no apology, no blame. Instead, the language emphasized responsible state behavior, regional stability, and mutual respect. Cross-border communication channels were reopened. Ambassadors, previously recalled, were reinstated. For the first time in months, the tone between New Delhi and Islamabad shifted from defiance to diplomacy. Kashmir at the center of the conversation. Crucially, the joint statement included a commitment to include Kashmiri representatives in any future negotiations regarding the region's status and governance. This marked a historic pivot, acknowledging, if only indirectly, the importance of Kashmiri voices in resolving the long-standing conflict. In Srinagar and Muzaffarabad, cautious optimism bloomed. Local leaders, civil society groups, and youth organizations began preparing position papers and community consultations, eager to participate in shaping their future instead of being passive subjects of it. Disengagement at the border. In the following weeks, military units on both sides began gradual disengagement under the supervision of neutral observers. Artillery was pulled back. Tents were dismantled. Troops were rotated out, replaced by lighter patrol units. Though skepticism remained, especially among senior military officials, the pullback was largely seen as a step toward normalcy. In once abandoned border villages, families returned home. Schools reopened. Harvesting resumed. Life was still uncertain, but it was no longer on hold. Healing the civilian wounds. Governments and NGOs alike launched parallel initiatives to assist civilians affected by the crisis. Reconstruction funds were dispersed. Medical teams were deployed to trauma centers in Kashmir and Punjab. Special programs provided psychological counseling for children who had lived through shelling and displacement. Artists, musicians, and educators stepped in to rebuild not just infrastructure, but culture and confidence. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered, because they acknowledged the invisible scars left behind. Media and the return to balance. With hostilities subsiding, media coverage gradually shifted from sensationalism to analysis. Leading newspapers and broadcasters in both countries began hosting cross-border panels, bringing together experts, veterans, and conflict survivors. Journalists who had once been sidelined for questioning the dominant narrative now found space to report more freely. Stories emerged not just of loss, but of survival, resilience, and unexpected solidarity. The public, weary of fear and fury, began showing interest in nuance. The role of the diaspora. Across the globe, the Indian and Pakistani diasporas, especially in the UK, Canada, and the US, played an under-recognized role in supporting peace. Community leaders organized interfaith events, issued joint appeals, and raised funds for victims on both sides. Some even used their influence to push Western lawmakers to encourage restraint and support diplomacy. Their efforts demonstrated that, even thousands of miles away, shared heritage could triumph over hardened borders. Economic reset and regional cooperation. The de-escalation opened the door for long-stalled economic talks. A bilateral trade summit was scheduled in Dubai, where business leaders from both nations discussed reopening border markets and reviving joint projects. The medical and pharmaceutical sectors were prioritized, with shared supply chains proposed to better prepare for future crises. While full normalization remained distant, even small deals signaled a willingness to shift from confrontation to cooperation, driven not by idealism, but by economic necessity. Reflecting on the costs. As the dust settled, both nations quietly reckoned with the costs of the crisis. Hundreds of lives had been lost, many of them civilians. Billions were spent on mobilization, surveillance, and emergency responses. Trust was eroded. But perhaps the greatest cost was the opportunity lost for progress, for regional growth, for the millions who simply wanted peace. Political leaders delivered solemn speeches, vowing that lessons had been learned. Whether those lessons would endure remained to be seen. A fragile peace, a new possibility. In the end, what emerged was not a sweeping peace agreement, but a fragile truce woven from fatigue, fear, and a flicker of hope. It was imperfect and incomplete, but it was real. More importantly, it created space for dialogue, for healing, for a generation raised on war to imagine something else. The border was still there. The wounds still fresh. But for the first time in years, the possibility of lasting peace between India and Pakistan was not just a dream, it was a distant, but visible, horizon. If you want to stay informed with the most recent news on global events and in-depth analyses, don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with others who should be aware of these important issues. Your support helps us bring you the latest developments as they happen. Leave your thoughts in the comments, your voice truly matters.